we are really excited about this webinar today. This is part of the CADRE Learning Series, and today's topic is the ethical use of AI in STEM education research. This was sort of a departure from our usual learning series structure. Typically, we take a topic that is of interest to DRK-12 PIs or prospective PIs, and we put together a group of folks as a panel to talk about and discuss and consult on whatever that topic is. This time we went a little bit different direction. There is another team on the CADRE leadership group that has been working with a lot of the folks who you see here on this panel on developing a research brief on ethical use of AI in STEM education research. So we wanted to use this opportunity to kind of almost disseminate the ideas that the team had put together, and they'll tell you a little bit about that because the brief hasn't been released yet. But because this is such a timely and topical and urgent issue, we thought maybe we could use a learning series webinar to share some of their thinking about these really critical issues. Okay, next slide. So the structure of today is going to be some introductions. Oh, I actually needed the other slide to do the introductions. Oops, but I'll tell the agenda and then we'll go back. We're going to have presentations by each of the panelists. I'm going to do a little discussant role. And then we're going to spend a lot of time with discussant comments with some responses from the panelists, and then we're going to turn it over to you for Q&A. And just so you're aware, we're using the Zoom webinar format, which is a little different than the Zoom meeting format. There's the chat function, which you're welcome to use to just talk and connect. The Q&A is a separate chat function, and those are for questions for the panelists specifically. Some of them we can incorporate into the discussion, and some of them panelists might just answer offline. Can we move back, Ilana, to, there we go. Okay, so this is the team that we have here today to talk about the ethical use of AI in STEM education research. First, we have Tiffany Barnes, a computer scientist from North Carolina State University. Then we have Joshua Danish, a learning scientist from Indiana University. We have Samantha Finkelstein. I forgot to ask you, Samantha, if you're a Finkelstein or a Finkelstein, sorry.
Finkelstein.
Finkelstein, okay, I was right. From Carnegie Mellon. And then Oli Molvig from Vanderbilt University, historian of science and technology studies. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Tiffany Barnes.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for being on the webinar today. Really happy to be here and talk with you all about AI ethics in STEM education and research. Can you go to the next slide? Many of us on the panel, including myself, Joshua, and Oli, are from the NSF AI Institute for Engaged Learning. And the focus of that institute is on narrative-centered learning environments and AI within those environments and across and also outside those environments. So the entire institute is focused on creating new multimodal AI systems that can support learning in very innovative ways, from the sort of traditional data-centric ways under educational technologies, but also in terms of like adding voice and audio and graphics and doing AI across all the different places where learning is happening. And it's also building pipelines for multimodal data combination and building novel AI systems in order to combine those to support learning. And all of this is in the context of narrative learning. And if you look at this image, underneath everything is a consideration of ethics. And we consider that to be a cross-cutting concern across the Institute. And so several of us worked on this brief as part of our work for the Engage AI Institute. Next slide. I also have to mention that I'm the co-PI and co-founder of the STARS Computing Core, which was founded in 2006 with funding from the National Science Foundation. And we do a whole lot of activities, including annual events, the Respect Research Conference on broadening participation in computing, the STARS Celebration Conference, which helps computing faculty and students learn how to do K-12 outreach, research, and service to support diversity and broadening participation efforts. We have webinars around the academic year, and we have student chapters, basically like clubs on university campuses. And we have this year started a program called the STARS AI Scholars Program, where we worked with the Invite Institute and the Engage, so the NSF AI Invite and Engage Institutes, to have 30 undergraduates learn about and plan a K-12 AI outreach project. Next slide. I have a lot. I'm going to mention some of my research, and I always want to show pictures of the people that I work with because nothing happens without other people around here. So there are quite a lot of people currently in my lab. We have about 30 alumni from the lab, including Samantha, being an undergrad that worked with me many, many years ago. Next slide, please. BOTS is a game that we've made for studying programming and supporting programming learning. Next slide. And Deep Thought is an example of a data-driven tutoring environment that builds AI based on prior student data and uses AI systems to support student learning. Next slide. And this is an example of augmenting the SNAP learning environment with proactive positive feedback and progress monitoring, so students can tell where they are along a task doing programming. So a common theme across all of these is that my research work has always been to take student data and apply data-driven techniques and AI to those techniques, along with human intelligence, to create supportive learning environments specifically to help students when they need it, whether they ask for it or not, and try to optimize when that help occurs, and to do things like, we're also working on things like helping teachers understand when students need help. Next slide. And then within the AI brief, I took a systematic literature review that went through from a software engineering and AI perspective, what are the common AI ethics principles cited across different AI work coming out. This was a 2022 systematic lit review that came out. It's referenced on this slide. And the main principles that came out in that study were transparency, explainability, accountability were the top three principles for ethical AI research, along with things that followed, including justice, fairness, privacy, autonomy, human dignity. And then the other principles listed on this slide were not as commonly mentioned. And then we tried to put all these together, because if you just read a list of common AI ethics principles, it's really difficult to think about, like, okay, how do I prioritize ethics in my AI education research? And what questions do I ask? Because we can't possibly be perfect and do everything. We already have many, many constraints and requirements from FERPA to, just why do we do research in the first place? So what we tried to do was frame for people across disciplines, one common thing we all need to do is apply for IRBs. So we tried to group the principles according to the principles that we use for IRB: respect for persons, justice, and beneficence. But you can see we've actually put justice on the left here, because respect for persons in a large sense is often covered by FERPA in an educational context, like, don't release people's data. Let them know what you're doing. We're not very good at letting them know what we're doing in educational software. Beneficence, we almost always check the box, because when we write proposals, we say we're going to do something good, right? We're all focused on doing something good. So justice should be front and center, the first thing you think about when you're thinking about AI ethics in a system, because there's nowhere else where we're sort of forced to think about it. And if we don't think about it, the way that AI works is that it takes existing data and existing environments, and it learns from those in ways that are similar to people, like finding patterns and then replicating those patterns into algorithms. And it doesn't do it in a very explainable way. So if we don't actually design for justice, thinking about systems of oppression and how to actively counter them in the work that we do and the technologies that we build, then we're going to systematize even further the systems of oppression that exist. So what we really should do, instead of just looking at a list of principles and trying to pick which ones we should do, like be transparent. You know, I could try really hard and spend lots of time on being transparent, but does it really matter? Probably not. Not as much as it matters that I think about, are children of all kinds getting access to the technologies I'm building? Are the poorest schools ever going to get to be able to use the tools that we're making? If I don't build that into my research project at the beginning and say, this is my ethics principle that I want equitable access to my tools, it's never going to happen. So that's why that's front and center. So we've tried to pull these principles together, but in a way that you can think about what's most important to you, what's important for ethics, and also to give some guiding questions. So if you look under justice, we're saying who and where are the people that receive benefits from this research and these technologies. And if you look under respect, the guiding question there at the bottom is, you know, how are people prioritized? We want to prioritize people, human people, over any other kind of people. And also look at how data and decisions are handled. Because like I said, transparency is not, you know, the most wonderful thing ever. I want to be transparent, but I only want to be transparent when it's important. If it's not important how my system retrieves a web page to show it to you, I don't need to teach you about that. It's only important if someone's going to use the information that is hidden to make a decision about you. So that's why data and decisions are centered in that guiding question, because if someone's going to make a decision, do you get to go to the next grade level, or do you get to be in a more advanced science learning environment? If that's being handled by an algorithm that's not transparent, that's a problem. All right, and then the last question under beneficence is, you know, why are we doing this work, right? So we need to have a theoretical foundation. We need to have, we need to think through, like, is it actually worth the cost of using AI that actually are taking resources from the environment to do this work? So that's my intro. Thank you.
Thank you, Tiffany.
All right, great. Thanks, Tiffany, and welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'm Joshua Danish, a learning scientist at Indiana University, and we could just go ahead to my only slide, which is the next one. What I wanted to talk about briefly here, so if you're interested in my work, which is around designing to help learners represent their ideas in STEM environments, you could check out my website, which is there. But what I really wanted to talk about today is how we think about the design of technologies so that they're including learning, ethics, AI, all of these big ideas that are important. And in my past life, I was a software engineer and educational software designer before I was a learning scientist, and that informs my work, although a lot of this is always done in collaboration, and many of you likely collaborate. So what I chose as an image here to represent some of that thinking is a re-envisioning of the conjecture map that Bill Sandoval proposed. And this is some work I did with my colleague, Megan Humberg, and some of our research team. And the idea here, the idea of the conjecture map is that when we create a design for learning, we should articulate our conjectures, our hypotheses about how theory is driving that design, and do so in ways that allow us and encourage us to reflect on whether or not the design and use is in fact informing our theory, potentially even changing our theory, and also to think about how design and theory and implementation of ideas are all different and overlapping. So what that means here, though, is trying to document what types of ethical questions we might ask ourselves as we engage in designing AI-based learning environments at all the different stages of the design process. And so if we walk from left to right, what I'm thinking here is, first of all, similar to the conjecture map, and let's see if this, can everyone see my arrow there? Hey, there we go. I don't know if that's going to stick around, but there's an arrow, so I'm trying to use it. If we start there, we're thinking first and foremost, what's the theory behind this design? What are we aiming to do? But really and in this case, what might be the reason, and do we even need AI in our work? And going back to the questions Tiffany asked, do we need AI for reasons that are good for humans, for learners, not just for NSF funding or not just for the tech geek in me, but where does that fit in? And then once we've decided we want to use that, we want to think about how we're translating those ideas about AI into our actual design. So this is that second column here. And in the original conjecture map, this would be what are the features that are coming out of your theory. But here, what I want to highlight is how, when we think about these designs, we might think about how AI is affecting our learners in the top, our teachers, and our researchers, each in different ways, because each of those will bring forward different kinds of questions. And we tried to highlight the ones we could think of. For example, at the top here, are there sensing and privacy questions? Are there ethical concerns related to training and bias? Are we building on text and art that might have copyright infringement? So many of these questions come up all over the literature, but here we were really trying to show that even just at the design stage, we want to think about that. And then in this next column, which is one I think a lot of people easily overlook. All right, I give up on the arrows, but the middle one here, the question we want to think about is, how does this lead to a change in processes for the learners? And with the original conjecture map, the goal there was to think in advance about how we see the impact of our learning theory in practice in a classroom or at a school environment. Here, the questions that I'm trying to promote are, how do our questions about ethics change when the tool we've designed is in use? Because of course, a tool in use and a tool in action is often going to have different affordances and constraints than what you designed and used in your laboratory. So here, for example, these sensing and privacy questions might transform. In my own work, for example, we use some very basic tag-based tracking to track kids moving around a classroom. And it feels pretty safe to us because you're being tracked, you've picked up the tag, nothing's being recorded, right? But in the classroom, we know, and my colleague Morgan Vickery has pointed this out really nicely, we know that moving around a classroom space in front of your peers can actually be really stressful. It can be really uncomfortable, right? And then knowing that that's being recorded might be even worse. So, and for other kids, it might mean nothing, and it's totally fine. But that means we want to think about that question again in this context of use. And then finally, on the right, we want to think about how we're measuring things and what that means for all of our ethical questions and concerns, and particularly as we think about not only measuring as an act, but measuring as leading to something that we are going to interpret and disseminate. And again, this is why we separated out learners from teachers from researchers, even though they're all interconnected. But a test may feel innocuous to kids, but if it frames them in a negative light, when researchers disseminate that or share that with teachers or publish it, that might have very different ethical implications. And this is actually true in all educational research, of course. But what we have found on our team and with our collaborators is that story gets further complicated when AI is in the mix, and when we have all of these collaborators with such very different expertise. And so, for example, I had a great conversation with a colleague the other day who does natural language processing, and we were talking about removing kids' names. And she said, well, sure, you can remove them, but we actually have a pretty good rate of detecting who the kid is based on their style of talking. And I've had other conversations with AI folks who say, oh, we don't need to worry about it because it's just on our server. And I say, well, that's not what the IRB says, right? So each of those is an example where one of our perspectives might have overlooked a possible concern. And it's the conversation across stages of the research that made them really central. So I hope I'm not running long, but the quick summary being that my goal in some of this work and in my own work is to think about how these ethical issues are stretched across all of the parts and processes of how we design for learning, how we support and implement our designs for learning, and how we write about them. And it really requires an extensive conversation across stakeholders and colleagues to do that. And that's it. One slide, but many minutes. Thank you.
Hi. This is a perfect segue into the bit that I'm going to share. If you want to go to the next thing while I do my stuff. So my PhD was in human-computer interaction at Carnegie Mellon, where I did education, and then I spent a few years doing financial education, and I'm now in a very meta way teaching AI developers about responsible AI, and what education looks like in that context. And agreeing with what everyone said so far, which is like, we can talk all we want about how to design AI systems ethically, but these systems are being deployed in classrooms and in school systems where there are existing structures of inequity that are the current status quo. And those inequities, I mean, exist in every facet of the world right now, and not everyone is fighting every problem at every time. And I think that when we have these conversations about how do we design this AI system to be ethical enough for my use case, for sure, we should be thinking about that question. Also, that question has to be more broadly understood as, okay, in my current learning environment, before I've added this in, how am I currently using students' data? So at the bottom of the slide here, right, I feel like there are 3 questions just always when you are working with data, whether it's AI or not, which is, what data do I have? What actual information do I have? And then what interpretive leaps am I making based on that data? What am I taking it to mean? And then what am I doing to people based on that? And so we've been doing this in education for a very long time. Student tracking is these same 3 questions, and that has had really bad outcomes for a lot of people. And it's true that doing that with AI in a more automated way that can take humans even more out of the loop has potential to cause harm. It also is having this other effect, though, which is that it is forcing us to all look at that really directly and write down exactly what our system is for making choices and justifying it and seeing what those outcomes are. And so one of the things that I'm hopeful about is that through these conversations about how to design AI ethically, we're all, in order to do that, we're all gonna have to be really clear about what our intended outcomes are for whom through our systems. And I think that is gonna make it easier for us to look back at the rest of the structures in which our systems are being deployed, our classrooms, and more broadly, wherever we're using them. And looking at the places where we're not actually very comfortable with the fact that maybe the student is being, harms aren't being perpetuated by this system, but that system is being deployed in this larger thing. What does that mean for how we can keep engaging? So I think a lot of it just being really honest with what data we actually have and what we're taking it to mean, and where we can find places where we are probably over-interpreting and we're making these leaps that are not fair to people based on that. That's all I'm going to say for this part here.
All right, well, thanks for having me. I'm a real pleasure to be here. My name is Molvig. I'm at Vanderbilt. I thought I'd actually introduce a little bit of how I got here, because it's not the most straightforward path. My PhD is in the Department of History. I do history of science, particularly cosmology, general relativity, kind of pretty technical physics in the 19th and 20th century. And when I finished up that kind of traditional historical project, I learned an enormous amount about how really hard technical issues interact with really broad social communities. That's kind of one of the goals of the community I think of myself from, Science and Technology Studies, SDS, where we have a lot of information about how those interactions work. And I wanted in my next project to really engage at this moment, taking those kind of skills and concerns and issues that I was trained in the humanities into active collaboration in fields around emergent technology. And in particular, bringing me to the AI Institute here, areas around AI in education, generative AI in creativity. Like Joshua did, I'll throw my website in there if you do want to take a look at the other kinds of projects that I do that are outside of the work here at the Engage AI Institute. A lot of them have to do with kind of creative explorations of the humanities and digital technologies. So this role of doing applied STS is kind of how I've been thinking about what I've been doing. I could be writing the history of AI, and I decided to collaborate with people like Joshua and Tiffany and others at the Institute for a particular set of purposes. And I'm going to kind of outline why my goals were in joining these types of projects and some of the work that we are doing at the Institute that kind of help to meet those goals. My colleagues have heard me say this so many times, but my primary motive in joining an interdisciplinary group like the Engage AI Institute is to really stress that ethics and social impact are a practice, a continued set of practices, not a checklist. It is not something that you do, you finish, you get done, and you don't have to worry about it anymore. And that is the thing that I say in so many meetings, and Joshua could probably give me a tattoo with this type of a slogan on it. I've been doing this so frequently. And that phrase I use, ethics and social impact, is one that I always put together. Both the idea that ethics are a set of kind of practices and viewpoints that one might have, and social impact is kind of the consequences they have out in the world. And it is possible in my world, or I asked the question, is it possible to act maximally ethical and yet have undesirable social impacts? And I think that's a good way of differentiating that. It's, again, you can't just think about the ethical practices or the best practices around data privacy. You also, as both Samantha and the rest of the panel has been talking about, need to be thinking about the social systems with which they are embedded and what those impacts look like, and not necessarily the obvious ones, right? These are things that, as anyone who studies this, and I'm sure most of us on this call understand, have really kind of complex, long-term, and often long-tail concerns. So another element that I really focus on is timing. And I love that Tiffany started one of her conversations around this topic. These are hard and complex issues without easy answers, but these topics need to be addressed as early as possible, not waiting to finish the study or finish the technique or whatever, or you've trained the model, and then you start wondering about some of the social or ethical impacts of that. These questions around impact, fairness, transparency, equity, all of these things need to be addressed as early as possible, not afterwards. You can go ahead and hit, yeah, we got the model card slide up already. So one of the things that we have been producing at the Institute with my group is a concept, a model card for AI that goes beyond model selection based on efficacy, for example. How fast is it? How powerful is it? What's its context window? Things along those lines, and start looking for how can we begin to label either practices or models or whole AI suites of practices around issues that have to do with the environment, around social fairness, around social justice. What kind of information do we need as researchers to really better make the hard choices based upon the particular projects you're working on? Well, what do you do when one model is maybe better at racial diversity, and maybe another model is better at gender diversity, or is better at privacy, or one has got full consent to be included in models and another one doesn't, but it performs better? These are all the kinds of really complex weights and balances that researchers are going to need to start thinking about. And there's not nearly enough information out there available to help us make informed decisions about a lot of these choices, particularly at various levels of kind of expertise in the stack. Inclusive language is another one, and I mean that as broadly as possible. I have a fabulous postdoc named Sarah Burris. We've been working together on this quite a bit, and in particular, she's been focusing on how to work with young learners and how to translate and adapt AI ethics work, such as the White House AI Bill of Rights, to both meet the unique needs and the viewpoints and the language and the understanding of how today's youth feel, think, and act around AI. So that's been a really big part of our projects as well. And then lastly, this has been probably the most fun part of the work I've been doing with them, is I can consider this to be kind of directly engaging with ethics. The Engage AI Institute, one of its primary centers of focus is around narrative, digital narrative-based interactive learning environments, which is super fancy terms for video games. So we are building video games that allow students to both learn about and engage directly with ethical questions around AI from the point of view of kind of an engaged, immersive experience. So that's the kind of work I do with Engage. You can see my website if you want to see a little bit more about the kind of more broad work I'm doing, and I'm super excited to be here.
Thank you so much. So it's a little funny being a discussant to a brief that hasn't been released yet, but I had the honor of getting to have a preview of the report that the panelists have put together. And so I just want to share a few reflections to sort of seed some of the Q&A and discussion we're going to have with the panelists. Okay, next slide, Jen. So first I want to start with a few appreciations. The literature review, the synthetic literature review that Tiffany cited about AI ethics ended up organizing some principles around the Belmont report. The idea of justice, beneficence, and respect for persons. And I think that there is a strength to that choice because it's a widespread and familiar ethical framework for researchers. When we write proposals, we have to be able to defend to our IRB how we're thinking of those things. This is my third bullet, but I'll say it next. The authors also really deliberately, even though justice is the last kind of principle mentioned in the Belmont report, they bring it to the front and they integrate it throughout the tools that they've developed in their framing of ethical issues. I also really appreciated the brief's effort to offer the tools, the concrete tools that they offered to researchers and users of AI in education. I think we need those kinds of tools because they, like Ole said, they can become a starting point for conversations and deliberations. And, you know, I think everyone made the point about that. It's not a checklist. This is some ethics are things that require deeper consideration and have like a long life beyond the tools that we build. So I wanted to start with those appreciations. And next slide, please. But as many of the registrants for this webinar pointed out, there are a lot of concerns about bias. I say that you all pointed it out because we asked when you registered what your questions were. And by far the most prominent question among you all was this question about bias. And I want to point everyone to scholar Ruha Benjamin, sociologist of technology, who has coined the term the new Jim Code, where she talks about how Jim Crow practices feed the new Jim Code, which are automated systems that hide, speed, and deepen racial discrimination behind the veneer of technical neutrality. And I've heard the panelists discuss their concerns about transparency and the need to really make these biases, pay attention to these biases and try to mitigate them. I think that we can push that deeper though. And I'm going to, next slide, please, draw on some critiques that have come from the Belmont report as a framing for thinking of ethics. So the Belmont report, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, was something that came out in 1974, so 50 years ago, in response to things like the Tuskegee syphilis experiment and some other research that was really unethical. And they were trying to create a framework that researchers could use to guide their work. I turn to biomedical ethicists as a model of critique because I think biomedical folks are kind of dealing with some of the same complexity that we are as educators, in that tools are built in one context in biomedical research and then propagated. And I think that AI ed research has that same capacity. So I'm just going to pull a couple of critiques that biomedical ethicists have brought to the Belmont framework. So one well-cited critique is that while the Belmont report was an impressive response to ethical issues of its day, the field of research ethics involving human subjects may have outgrown it. What we do, the environment that we're in, when we're managing data, when we're managing research with human subjects, has really fundamentally changed from 50 years ago, and we probably need to update our ethical frameworks to reflect that. Another critique, widely cited critique, is that the Belmont report places too much emphasis on individual choice and does not consider potential harms to non-participants. So for example, I'll illustrate that in just a second. And it does not account for the new modes of research we do with human subjects. And again, I heard echoes of this idea in the panelists' comments. I'm going to just draw this out a little bit further with one example from biomedicine. So this is an example of biomedical ethics, the BMI index, the body mass index. For those of you who aren't familiar with this critique, I've included a QR code to a podcast that breaks it all down in more detail than I'm going to be able to do right now. But basically, in 1830, there was a Belgian mathematician who thought of himself as sort of a sociologist who wanted to come up with an index that looked at people's ratio of height and weight just to describe populations. And he was very, very clear that it should only be used as a descriptive measure and not as a normative measure to determine who is and isn't overweight. His research was almost contemporary with the eugenics movement, which had the ideology of biological determinism. Importantly, the mathematician's sample was Northern Europeans who have propensity towards certain kinds of height and weight ratios that aren't representative of the whole population of the world. In the 20th and 21st century, as medicine was being standardized, BMI became a common tool that ended up having numerous social consequences that went beyond what the mathematician who designed it intended. For example, insurance premiums are often linked to BMI, with people with high BMIs being given more costly premiums. There's medical stigma when people with higher BMIs go and seek medical care, where they're just told to lose weight, even if that is not their presenting problem. We've even seen situations where there are denial of certain kinds of treatment protocols. This goes on and continues despite a 2005 journal, a JAMA article that revisited BMI and looked at the population to see what kind of death rates are associated with BMI. And it actually turns out that having a low BMI is more high risk than having a high BMI. But nonetheless, these social practices, which I see as rooted in eugenics ideologies, remain. So the moral of the story for us is that we can develop measures, we can put caveats on them, but once they leave our purview, they can get appropriated by people with ideologies and intentions that do not reflect our ethical commitments. And I think that that's a cautionary tale that we all need to be cognizant of as we develop tools with AI. Okay, so that is my comments. I would like, before we get into the Q&A, to let the panelists respond to my comments, expand on them, push back on them, and anyone can go.
I think there's a few different sort of angles here, but one, I love your BMI example. I think it's exactly demonstrative of the problem that we do constant. And so I think that like the parallel to that, and I think like student tracking that I mentioned, right, is really similar, where things can be made with good intention or neutral intention, but once they exist, it is really easy to misappropriate them. And BMI isn't AI based itself, but it's the sort of thing that AI can do, which once you have a model that can be applied in a different context, it can be used further. So I think that you're right to draw that parallel. I think in the application to like the Belmont report sort of broadly, I think that, the question of like, how do we protect research participants is a sort of separate one from like, how do we live in a society where people in academia otherwise are creating tools that aren't harmful. So I think that there's something to be said for taking the Belmont sort of terms, which have not been updated, which have been really kind of generic and broad for a really long time, and seeing what it looks like to apply modern contemporary practices of what does it look like to take care of people, to really respect them, to really add good to it, so that as researchers are thinking about it, it does tie in nicely to the IRB sort of process that exists. But I think that that is not certainly like a sufficient solution to the broader problem, which requires an answer that we're all thoughtful and present in the work that we're doing.
Yeah, I want to also thank you for calling this out, and part of the challenge is to try to pull together all these principles in a way that in a brief format that helps people have practical tools. And as you can see, we were all trying to sort of bridge the gap between there's a lot to learn about AI, there's a lot to learn about ethics, and even within those ethics principles, it's a lot to learn about what does each term mean and when are those terms important, right? So transparency being like a very large one, it doesn't mean that that's like just doing that makes you ethical, right? So, and the Belmont report doesn't make us ethical, right? And the BMI is a great example, and all of our technology, like a phone, right? Like, you know, shrinking down a computer that used to take the size of a building and putting it in your hand. You know, there's negative consequences to that. We have lots of addictive content on there, and we might look at it when we're driving another large vehicle and make problems. So we can't solve everything. So the goal for us was actually to try to tie the sort of existing research practice, especially for people like me. I'm a computer scientist, right? So I have a minimal social science background. But if I'm going to do human subjects research, I'm going to learn about the Belmont's principles. And so if I can tie the AI ethics principles that are commonly being talked about and used across systems to that, that was part of my goal, was to bridge to technologists who have very little, like they haven't read Race After Technology or Ruha Benjamin's other work or a ton of other books related to this. Yeah, I could mention some titles and maybe we can put some in the chat, which I have read, but like actually getting into that, right, in a brief article, like systems of oppression are important and we don't want to replicate them. But that's why we highlighted that and actually put it in a picture with the Belmont principles. It's like, you can't just check the IRB box. You also have to say, are you propagating systems of oppression? Is the technology you're making going to harm society or people more than it did? I would argue, let's say, go back to the BMI idea. Like me being able to calculate my own BMI, even though insurance companies can use this in bad ways, like me having the power to do something like once something's invented is also can be useful, right? You can use it for your own information. You can get informed. You can use that algorithm to calculate a number for yourself. And in a similar way, I really think everybody needs to learn how AI works and how computers work and make their own algorithms so they can solve their own problems, right? So that's the perspective I'm coming from, is that I want everyone to learn how to be creators so you understand what's being created and how it could be used, right? And then we also need to be able to have conversations in society so we can actually make laws that put boundaries around what people are allowed to appropriate technologies and AI for, and where they can use those things. So one of the questions in the Q&A was sort of, you know, who owns trace data, right? So when I make a piece of software and somebody interacts with it, I can record everything they do while they're doing that. Who owns that? Well, we all use maps all the time, right? And Google can trace where you are. And please, if you've never done it, go look and see where Google says you've been over the last month. And if it freaks you out, disable it. So trace data, if you allow it to ever get a hold of, you know, somebody to get a hold of it, they can store it. And we all need to understand that. And we all need to start having public conversations with policymakers and with one another and across technology and social science and education for us to actually be able as a society to start understanding how to put boundaries around these things.
I'll jump in for a second and echo that I also agree with the critique. And I think that my approach and the approach we all took in the brief draft is to really treat all of these issues as tied to sociocultural context, tied to interaction, right? Really understanding how things are happening in real moments, as Tiffany's saying, right, with real people. And I'm particularly interested in the fact that I really think these have to become increasingly more complex conversations where a lot of the participants don't actually understand what's going on. Right, this notion of informed consent is very different in any technically advanced space, I think, but particularly AI, where I have a undergraduate degree in computer science and I play with a lot of technologies, but I struggle to understand where my data is going when I, in some of the tools that I use in my everyday life. And so when I think about what does it mean to ask a teacher briefly but transparently if it's okay what we're going to do with their data, and then to somehow put that in a consent form that if it is more than 2 pages is going to lose all the parents anyway. That's really complicated, and there's no easy answer. So to connect that to Roger's question in the Q&A, and hey Rogers, yeah, who should be able to opt out? I would hope everyone, and everyone gets some good support in choosing, and I also think the ethical issues do in fact change. But I think, yeah, I think that's something that's really hard to understand, and it's hard. I would just be wary of anyone who tells you there's a simple answer, which we see plenty of on the internet. And I think we really need to think about what these conversations look like. One thing we did in the brief is try and come up with a way to represent the ethical concerns in a given software tool, and quickly realized that once we had grilled all of the engineers on our team, it was going to be 20 pages with explanations, and then still people might not follow it. So how do we condense that to something people can look at in a minute or two? There's no simple answer except ongoing conversations about what the community you're working in generally wants, ongoing conversations about what the students want. And truthfully, what I have seen is the IRB is paying far less attention to the dangers of technology than those of us in the know might. Right? I can often get away with saying, we'll use our institutional technology, and they say, great, then that's fine. And I'm looking at it saying, wait a second, I want our team to talk about that, because half of those tools are recording things. And even if the IT services have said it's okay because they're recorded safely, doesn't mean for sure those parents, children, and teachers want it out there in the internet, even if it is safe, in air quotes, of course. So yeah, I guess that's what I would really promote, is talk about it more often on your team. And it's hard to do because we get wrapped up in the design discussion, in the logistical needs, in the cool software features, in the learning theory, and making sure we keep stepping back and saying, what does it mean for this to be ethical? What does it mean for people to have privacy, to have choice? I think it's just really messy, and we need to talk about it and share what we're finding in our writing, hopefully, so that others in the field can see that as well.
And I think it's just yeah, I love what you said. And I think it's really tricky because the thing is, like with the consent, make sure things aren't recorded without consent. But even with consent, we don't really know what those risks are. The parents of the students who are the ones giving consent are not going to be equally informed about the dangers of all of it. And so it's true that technically having the checkbox of parental consent maybe makes it better than if they didn't have a chance to check that off. But I think it's really tricky because it's like there's two things, right? There's permissibility, where IRB is like, sure, that's permissible. You can get away with that. If something goes wrong there, you're not going to be held accountable to it, which I guess is a useful line to have also. But going beyond that to ethics, it's hard because the field is so new and evolving so quickly that we don't know what the risks are. And it's hard to know what informed consent means, even if it's given, to take on those risks.
I'll jump in real quick. I think the core point you brought up in the comments there is really the heart of the challenge we had with writing an essay like this, how to navigate between giving an answer of ethics is complex, you need to talk about it more. And I find that we love in my field to talk about it a lot, and then talk about it again the next week, the next year, and so forth. And how to move from that really good intention to kind of actionable actions that don't trivialize all of that discussion, which are, okay, well, I've gone ahead and added some more sample faces to my data set, and then I'm done. Or I've gone ahead and added a checkbox for the parents so that they've agreed to it, so I don't have to care about it anymore. So what I was really engaged with the brief that we wrote is trying to figure out how to give some practical solutions to advance beyond just you should be good and you should be fair, but you also shouldn't just check a couple of boxes. And so the model cards and the reflection maps were really kind of meant to be structured places for thinking, I guess is one way to think about it. They're definitely more than a checkbox. And I don't think either of us who are giving these kind of cards would suggest, well, just do the 5 things that are on them and you're done. But they're meant to be a way of kind of organizing what are the set of questions and concerns that are unique to the subspecialist who is working on a particular project, because the project that someone was working on gunshot detection, audio signals is a different set of concerns than the one that's working on job applications sorting or whatever the case might be. And having a framework that's flexible enough that you can have all of these different kind of use cases find something meaningful in them, versus it being so specialized that each group has their very own set of ethical practices is just a nearly impossible challenge. So the example from Kelly, I love it with the BMI as when I talk about ethics and social impact, that's a perfect example of a set of mathematical principles that make sense in one formulation, but then when kind of released, often over time, we start seeing both the intended and more often unintended consequences of some of these choices. And to have a framework that lets you identify those, reflect on those, make changes because you've kind of got new information, and that information might be beyond the scope of what you collected in the first place, are really important. But the critique you have of picking any given social theory and then trying to apply it verbatim is always going to run into missed opportunities or misfit for what those use cases are. But it 100% is really worthwhile. And I really like your suggestion of thinking of what might an updated set of principles that are general enough that they kind of hit a lot of the researchers and thinkers across the field, something like the Belmont principles, but maybe one that are intentionally kind of rethought and recreated. And there's been a lot of work in the AI Bill of Rights and a bunch of other ones that are trying to do work along those lines. And I think having as much of those discussions about what would be a new framework, or what are what is the value of a framework? Is it just meant to be inspirational? Is it meant to be actionable? Is precisely the kind of questions we hope to continue having.
Yeah, I want to add one thing. So just to pull all these together, which is that the intention of the brief was that we have conversations. So I mentioned earlier, like conversations in society, because we need like bigger guardrails for everyone around, our own personal data and for different cultures and for different communities, but I do think some of the, and then the framework was there to sort of list the principles you might want to think about, right? And then the different tools were meant for both within a research team, within a single person, and also within a research team, and then across an entire, like an ed tech design. Like this was also meant for like software developers and technology developers to think about like, okay, what are the stages? Like I'm designing something, but the whole purpose of like the conjecture maps that Joshua cited that were sort of the precursor to the reflection map were, you've got technologists and education researchers together. Well, an education researcher says, I need X. And the technologist goes, good, I know how to make X. I'm going to go do it. They don't necessarily mean the same thing, right? The technologist thinks X means this, and the education researcher thinks X means that. And then the technologist goes and does something. And then when you try to deploy it, different things happen, right? Or decisions got made like, oh, I'm only going to allocate this much space. And then everybody's data gets lost. And things don't work because there wasn't a conversation between all the people on the team. And one of the things we tried to call out in the brief was that in every project that we're doing, there's different phases of the work. And there's also, even the software has different phases of data collection, data interpretation, and data usage. That was the data designs part. And that's where we think at the boundaries of our systems, in between the idea to the implementation is a boundary, right? You could possibly have a mistranslation between those. And then similarly, when I take my data and I transform it into an interpretation, I can have a boundary, right? I can say, oh, well, our facial recognition software says that this look that Oli has is disengaged. And that's just might be Oli's face. And, but if I label a person as disengaged, and what if later, a company buys all of a whole school's data for 12 years. And then we say, oh, nobody has to write a resume anymore. We've got all your interaction data for 12 years, but Oli got marked as disengaged and nobody ever hires anybody who ever got marked as disengaged. That's not fair, right? So we have to think about all of these things and those boundaries in between the decisions that get made. That's why the decisions and the data are called out in our framework. And then all these frameworks have stages and boundaries that we're trying to call out and identify so that people actually have the places to say, oh, well, where can data get out of my system? Where did data get transformed into a decision? What is that decision? When that decision gets made, how does it leap out of my system and then impact the rest of the world and the downstream effects for individuals and communities? And we took out, like, you know, respect for persons was the phrase in the Belmont, but we put respect, and respect for people is a broader thing. And as you've mentioned, you know, that's an old conceptualization that's individualistic, but the idea is that if we also incorporate thinking about systems of oppression and also communities and cultures as things to be respected, right, which was listed in the beneficence portion of our diagram, if we're trying to think from all those different perspectives, we're going to start to build a broader idea, like what does respect mean and what does beneficence mean, and thinking broadly about downstream impacts of all of our systems. These are complicated and they're hard to do. And a lot of times people making decisions in our systems are grad students or people we hired for a short amount of time to do something, and they're not equipped to do these things. So our teams have to have processes, right? Even once we make something, we have to go back and say, are we propagating harm? Do we still keep using this system? How is the system getting used? What do we do about it? And are there ways that humans can intervene and sort of override AI or algorithm or technology decisions? One thing I wanted to highlight, though, is I think there was a question earlier. It was like, you know, if you've got different levels of kids, like, you know, people using a system, like, how do you decide who gets, you know, how do people make decisions and how the ethical ideas change? There's the systems of power that matter, right? So a kid has to go to school. And if the school decides that a technology has to be used for something, they got to use it. Otherwise, they're not doing science or whatever. You know, what are they going to do? Worksheets? So they don't have as much autonomy. So there's those principles in the Belmont principles are still useful because you know, we're thinking about who has power in the systems that we're in and whether they get to choose how much choice do they have is an important thing.
Thank you all so much for your thoughtful responses. I want to turn over to the Q&A, and just to remind participants, we have a few unanswered questions right now, a few open questions in the chat, but please use the Q&A box for any questions that you want the panelists to engage with. Yeah, we're going to distribute the brief to everyone who registered for this webinar once it is released. We have a question from Catherine Ziska that says, when thinking about perpetuating inequalities, how easy is it to update the system once an issue is identified? You're muted, Tiffany.
Button. Once a system is made, like I'm an engineer with computer science background. Once we make a system, that's the most expensive time to make a change, which is why justice should come before you make your system. But the truth is that we have lots of systems we're going to use. And actually, we can't go back and unmake LLMs and remake them to be just. Partly because all the data they were used to train on is they needed that much data to be able to learn what they learned. But it's also the real data about society, right? My kid learns that, like, 2 years ago, she's 7, 2 years ago, she didn't know what a Black person was. Now she does because she's in our society, right? So we can't go back and take the context out. Also, AI systems need a huge amount of data to actually be trained. So it depends on what you're taking out. So the great thing is that there are people working on how to correct things after you have built a system. Like, you can, let's say, if we got facial recognition that doesn't work well for people of color or for older people, which is true, then you can go back and you can augment those systems with extra data for those data sets, and you can retrain them until their accuracy is similar to others. But if your principle of equity along the disaggregated, like, cultural and societal differences, if you're looking at that, like if you're taking metrics across that, that's very common in the Fairness, Accountability, Transparency Conference, ACM conference, you know, to go back and look at, like, what are the features of data sets and how can we re-engineer, like remaking these AI systems so they can be more fair. That can be done. But if you think about it, though, if I get a NSF grant to build an educational system for a middle grades science curriculum, and then we find out 2.5 years into the 3-year project that, you know, it's inequitably providing learning to students, I've only got 6 months left of my funding. I can't go remake the whole thing. So it's very expensive and it's very unlikely to happen.
So there's systemic, part of what I hear you saying is that there are systemic conditions that make it more challenging in certain phases of technology development to remediate inequities that are surfacing.
That's true, but also you can think about any software, for example, that we build. You know, anytime you build something, you take some sort of moldable material and you turn it into something, and it hardens as you have the design, right? And the harder it is, like, think about clay, right? If I make something out of clay, before I get started, no problem to change from making an elephant to making a tree. Once I've already started making an elephant, turning it into a tree is quite hard. And software is very similar, right? Once I made a bunch of parts, it's very hard to change it.
I would just add briefly that it depends quite a bit on what that inequity ends up being. Like there are going to be some forms that are easier to fix in kind of trading data and perpetuate, but this is why we stress this, the timing of this so heavily is for every one of them, it's so much easier to do so on the early end, but it is unrealistic to think you're going to be able to imagine all possible outcomes, all possible blind spots, because they're blind spots and you don't have them. And the best ways of overcoming them is through as much user testing with your users that you would actually have, making sure you have a wide variety of viewpoints on your team and development, read widely on what other issues and problems that people have had in the past or are having kind of going forward. But you are never going to be able to catch all of them. And this is why we need to make sure we have systems that are that have the ability to be monitored and corrected as much as possible. So planning for the unexpected is something that's built into very few of the systems, even the ones that are going to have quite a strong impact on people's daily lives.
Actually, as a design principle, that seems like a smart one to try to build into projects. You know, part of what I've gathered from listening to you all and reading the report is having checkpoints at various stages of your development seems like one way to mitigate potential unanticipated things, but also just knowing that, you know, you're going to need to constantly revisit because part of what's so complicated about, you know, designing in the world we're living in is that the ramifications and the potential for dissemination is constantly changing as, you know, computational power is increasing, and there's just such a moving target. I'm going to pull another question from the chat. Shuchi says, tech companies gather data from all of us, including teachers, students, our research participants. We as researchers are rightly held to a higher standard if teachers and students refuse to participate in our research when all the capture use of data are fully explained. How do we conduct ethical research? How do we thread that needle? What are ways we can address this challenge and these somewhat conflicting reactions on the part of research participants? Might it make sense to our participants to draw comparisons like between everyday data given to tech companies versus research data collected by researchers?
I like that suggestion. I think the parallel is true. I think that broadly anchoring people, like that is a pretty like common and good technique for helping to anchor people's answers by giving this sort of metaphor of what it is actually like. I think the challenge there is going to be making sure that we're telling the truth about that. And with the, you know, with accurate awareness of how safe our system is compared to systems that they also would be using, I think that it gets us closer to being able to make informed consent.
I want to mention that that's important because it goes with the explainability and AI literacy principles, right? So the extent to which that we explain how systems work, I think is very challenging, right? So I've given some examples of how AI works, like large language models basically needed all of the internet to be able to learn how people talk and be able to retrieve information like a search engine. So the amount of complexity built into large language models is quite high. So if I had to explain to someone how the large language model they're using is working, they would never get to do the task they were actually trying to do. So we have to balance that out. So I think metaphors are good. And I also think we have to remind people like stuff before we ask them questions, right? So I was at a paper at the Learning Analytics Conference several years ago that they had surveyed undergrad students, like, should professors be able to, collect your data and use it for improving their courses? And actually, overwhelmingly, as I remember, a lot of the students said no. And I'm like, how am I supposed, like, the thing is, students expect you. They're like, if I write an exam question and it's too hard, students expect you to figure out that it was too hard and not ask a hard question next time. But if I'm not allowed to use your data for anything, then how am I supposed to do that? So what I'm saying is we got to call up, like, okay, realize that you actually want your kids to learn stuff and you want the educational system to get better as it goes. We do need to be able to use data to improve that. And that's why there's exceptions for IRB for like educational research. It's like, I can't make my education better without that. So that's why education is a specific example for AI ethics, and reminding people, like, making those metaphors so they can understand what you're talking about is a way that you can address some explainability and transparency without like taking too much time and like not allowing them to be able to do the thing, but also to make an informed choice. Like, yeah, I do want you to be able to use my data, but maybe my professor shouldn't be able to see my demographics, right? Because I can see a difference in our data systems right now in universities, right? I can't see people's gender or demographics anymore on any rosters. I used to be able to see that.
I think a really nice metaphor to add to that one that is comparing research data collection and private company, tech company data collection would be government data collection as well. And so for a century or more, Americans have had a really different approach to what kind of data it's willing to give away to private companies. Often this concept of being an exchange of value, right? You give your data away to gain some benefit. Whereas for many of us, the government data is more about surveillance, and the level of concern that individuals tend to have is really different in those two contexts. And I do think that research data is often seen as closer to that surveillance data than as the gaining benefit data. And probably at times for very good reason, but knowing the distinction that many users make between those two different kinds of what they get out of it, and making it clear that for some type of research, right, much of the research that we probably plan on doing, we intend there to be a really strong, tangible benefit, much in the way that getting to have a free email account or watch videos without ads is considered to be kind of a value to that person. So I think thinking in those terms and finding ways of both honestly matching those goals and letting your users know that these are the benefits that are done, if they're individual or if they're regional or if they're national, is a really good strategy to take.
So I think the easy solution that's been proven is you just need a 50-page terms of service that no one reads and just clicks on. And obviously I'm kidding, I hope, but part of my point there is that I think this is where, as educators, it's important that we help everyone realize that the reason they're okay with Facebook taking all of their data and not their professor is because Facebook has obscured intentionally, but in plain sight, all of the ways they could potentially abuse that and not worry about it, right? So that's a systemic issue and an educational issue that I think hopefully we're the right people to be helping the next generation how to think about that. The other thing is, I think we as a field can help promote tech solutions that foreground the need to think about these issues. Right? It's really easy to say, well, we'll run this on a local protected server, so we don't have to worry about solving the problem of how to safely collect the data. We'll just worry about how to lock up the hard drive. But that won't translate, right? But if we say, it's really important to figure out how we can understand kids in the classroom without ever having information on a server that's going to make them uncomfortable, and help promote that as an important problem to solve, right? And help the NSF promote that, then there will be more motivation, more money. And the last thing I wanted to add there, and this is partially an answer to I think Eva Maria's question, or Eva Maria, I apologize, of how do we get how do we have these conversations without being laughed at? I think the answer is start with conversations where we learn what our community cares about and is worried about, and in what terms. Because no one in my family wants to hear me talk about ethics, but if I talk about sales or theft of identity, they really get concerned, right? If we talk about privacy, sometimes they're concerned, right? Whatever the case may be. And I think that's where we want to have these multiple layers of conversations with our community, with the different stakeholders, and say, what are you worried about? And I know concretely in my context, talking to the IT folks in the school districts is an important step. Whether you want their opinion or not, they're going to be a gatekeeper, and they're going to be an informant, hopefully, to the teachers. So knowing what they're thinking about, what they're sharing with the teachers is important. Knowing what the teachers, what the parents, and that takes some time and energy, obviously, but I think it's worth it for us to understand what people are actually nervous about, and then speak to that, right? Sort of what Tiffany was saying earlier about transparency on things nobody cares about. Us being transparent on is not necessarily helpful. It's just a lot of text that still won't be read, but knowing where they're nervous about it, and honoring and respecting that, I think, is an important first step to get folks on board with making sure they see the same things that concern you. I don't like the phrase helping them see the things that you want to be cautious that they see, I think would be better.
There's a couple of questions in the chat that I think there's a couple of quick answers to. For Patrick's question about how we think about maintenance is usually thought of as a strictly technical problem, but we actually, there are ethical issues that may need to be dealt with when we build our systems. How do we think about that? There's a great answer to that question, which is there's a book called Ethical Machines by Reed Blackman. And I can't click on anything in Zoom anymore, so otherwise I would post the link. But you do need a process. And the sort of idea in that book is that people who are making AI technologies need to start having a set of practices to deal with mitigating issues that arise from AI. And it needs to be part of the practice, and you need buy-in from everyone. And it needs to become part of the technical and maintenance plan, is that there needs to be recourse for mitigating harms that could be coming out. I think it's quite difficult for researchers at universities to plan for these things, because we're often, working on soft money with grants, and then, we maintain our software out of the goodness out of our hearts, or the almost free labor of graduate students, which can also be unethical. So how do we even deal with that? That's quite difficult. But it's sort of like we build these systems because we believe they're helpful, and then we try to mitigate their potential harms. Like if we were to find out that, our systems were, being harmful, we would probably shut them down rather than maintain them. But honestly, because we don't have money to do that. And then
It's almost like
sorry, go ahead. I'm done.
I was just going to say that it's almost like our research grant model, where we have these episodic resources that then come to an end, are not really well suited to our current environment, because the afterlives of these technologies is not accounted for in that model. And, unless you're going to partner with an ed tech company who is committed to maintaining it, but then it's outside of your locus of control anyway, and their motivation is profit, so their ethics are going to be shaped by that. So it seems kind of a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation, and that it's one of the ways that our current infrastructure for research may not be suited to some of these technologies that we're playing with.
I absolutely agree with that. And I think it was great that Oli pointed out the sort of differences in how people think about government versus sort of trading for service. Because, I think in a prior era, the government existed to make good stuff for everyone, and sort of the responsibility, to make awesome things was like put in, like, everyone needs education, so let's make sure the government provides that. But now the sort of thought about what that is and how it should work is quite different, and who's responsible and whether or not it's worth the money that's getting spent is always a question that keeps getting asked. So
well, it's like, it reminds me of how in a lot of European cities, there's civic engineers whose job it is to maintain and extend railway systems. Whereas in the US, we don't have that role as commonly. So when you want to build a new subway line, you have to do like competitive bids, and like the cost per mile of subway track ends up being like significantly more expensive than it would be in a place where those were roles. So if we had something like the equivalent of civic engineers that kept their eye on the internet infrastructure or technological infrastructure, who that was their ongoing job, to like keep their eye on the ethics and you know, issues of the technology infrastructure. But we just, like you said, Tiffany, we're kind of in a different era of government in this country, in the US. So we don't really think in those sort of civic good, collective good terms. We've got another question that I think we have time for. Jennifer Borland asks, are there more things we can be doing to better educate people about the healthy/good uses of data and data sharing?
I know there's a lot of people working on like data science and data analytics curriculum for K-12. And when I read that question, I was thinking of my kids, right? My son is 14, he's in middle school, and he's been learning about like, oh, when I do a search, are the sources, you know, reputable, and, you know, how can I use them and that sort of stuff. So there are curricula being built in, but they're so behind, right? It takes so long to get these things into the schools. So, I mean, I think we're on a good trajectory for people to learn more about data and how to handle it and what can be done with it and what are the good, healthy and good uses. It's very difficult. So are there more things we can be doing? Certainly. I think maybe we need some better ways to help people think about the data that comes out of what they're doing with a system, like just start teaching kids like more earlier, right? To take parallels between the data they see, like, oh, when you're at school, you know, when you are learning to read, your teacher sometimes gets out an iPad and, you know, asks you some questions, and then she records what you've been saying. And then you get this, you know, this score about how you're reading. Like that is data about you, about your reading. And the teacher is just using it to see if you're ready to do the reading that's in the next grade level, right? Like we need curriculum that actually takes the vocabulary of data, data science, data analytics, AI, and those translation of that data into what happens with it. Like we have to sort of have that literacy along with the AI literacy. Like how does AI work? How do algorithms work? How does data work? Which goes back to my original point that like we all need to learn how all these abstractions and data and algorithms work, and think about them as like almost like we have a physical body and then we have this virtual body of stuff that's getting accumulated because of the nature of digital data and the internet. And related to that, I'd like to recommend to y'all the Bits book. It's bitsbook.com, which is Blown to Bits, which is a book was written like 15 years ago, but it was very relevant and talking about the idea that since we have actually transformed so much information to be digital, and the fact that it never disappears, and the fact that everything's now connected, we have very different issues to think about. And that's a fundamental thing. If we can teach people about that, then they can start to be skeptical in the right kind of ways and have discussions in the right kind of ways.
I would add brief. Oh, go ahead, Joshua.
I was going to jump in on Elliot's question. So if you're answering,
I was going to add briefly. It's one of the elements that we are working on with translating things like the AI Bill of Rights for kids, is that we adults often have one set of concerns and a way of talking about particularly data privacy that is often fairly parallel to like hygiene talk of kind of, you know, good practices and things you ought to be doing and so forth. And kids' perspectives sometimes don't reflect that same set of concerns about or what that kind of parallel would be. So also finding ways of kind of meeting kids where their concerns are at. They're very concerned about privacy, but often for different kinds of sets. They often for a right to be left alone, to be able to make mistakes, to be able to goof off without having to be kind of concerned around this, to misbehave, to do bad things, and to kind of have a space for that, which is usually not part of what most adults think of when they're thinking about kind of data privacy. So in addition to the kind of ways we teach kind of proper instruction and kind of best behavior, also remembering to find other ways of reinforcing those messages with ones that are kind of kid native in that sense. I think it's a really useful strategy.
Great. So I'll pivot to Elliot's question, which was what are the unique issues that arise with qualitative analysis and AI technologies? I think this is a really, really important issue, especially because I get 1 or 2 advertisements a day from one of these companies that all profess to have achieved something truly amazing, like the removal of bias, which I would argue any qualitative researcher I've ever spoken with would say that's not a thing. So it's it's not a hard problem; it's an impossible problem. So I think, of course, there are some technical issues, but the bigger issue in my mind is that we need to make sure we're pushing back and talking about the ethical, but also the philosophical, methodological, and theoretical underpinnings of what we do when we do qualitative research, and how those may not be aligned with particular AI approaches or data sets, right? Like, do I think an AI might more quickly come up with themes in my data than my graduate student? Quickly, yes. But in ways that are attuned to the context or the concerns or the cultural nuances, no way. Right, we know these systems are all using something like ChatGPT under the hood, and we know those are massively biased, right? And they're trained on an internet that is, quite frankly, frightening at times with its perspective. So I don't want a system trained on that to be looking at our data and simplifying it. But taking it one step further, a lot of what is automatically detected by AI are the low-hanging fruit that are the first technically feasible step, right? And that makes a lot of sense from a technical standpoint, right? That we're going to evolve our technology by picking the things we can do easily and then building on them. But often, if we get some qualitative theorists in the room who I would trust and respect, they're going to start with something that the AI folks in the room would say is impossible. And they're going to work from that direction. So I've been spending a lot of time on my team. We've been thinking about how AI can support human analysts instead of human analysts supporting AI, and how that becomes a conversation where the need to understand the data and the participants comes first, and the value of efficiency or breadth of analysis that technology can bring comes second. That just happens to be our commitment, but I think the important thing there is open those black boxes, right? Don't assume that because an AI says it will detect emotion, that makes any sense, when we know for sure we can't get 2 graduate students to agree on whether, a particular emotion is present, especially if the kids in the data or any of the graduate students are from different cultural backgrounds, right? Because those things look different. And we train our students to recognize that, and we try to recognize that in our analysis, and the AI will treat that as noise, right? So yeah, I think that's a really, really important question. I'm glad you asked it. And I think there's so many people jumping on this because it's fast and easy and cheap and lets you put a bunch of statistics at the end of your paper. So I encourage you all to think deeply about when you're using those, and put that in your methods discussion, and why you made the choices you did, and why they're okay, and why they don't threaten participants or validity or theoretical consistency, et cetera.
There's 2 things I want to add to that. One is you want to try to make sure that your qualitative data isn't getting freely gobbled up by the system you're using. So you want to make sure that you read that license agreement, or that you're using an open LLM that you've got on your own server that allows you to put data into it that doesn't go back to feed the LLM some more. That's one thing. And then the other one is, I think there's something you called out in there that I think we need to make more salient, which is, if you do use AI tools to help you understand your data better, you want there to be a connection between what it gives you and where the source is in your data. So for example, I love to use AI to like group things, like, oh, all these phrases have similar words in them. That's something very easy. NLP is like bag of words, right? So doing that can help, because a lot of times when we're writing a paper with a qualitative analysis, we want some quantitative data, like this many phrases like this were used. So doing that kind of stuff is really useful. But I think what tends to happen, especially with my students, I'm not going to say any of y'all's do this, is that they don't want to read it all. right? They want the system, a system to say this many times this was said, and here's what the themes are, and then they just want to be right and be done. And the thing is that we want to digest the information, we want to apply the cultural context, and we want to also say, if we use any tools and we make links, but themes, we need to examine all of that and see, does it actually really make sense in the context? And we need to be able to, and that's one thing that LLMs alone won't do, right? So if you feed your data in and it'll say, these are the themes, it won't come back and tell you where it got it from. So you really need, there's some newer techniques like RAG and some other techniques that you can augment the AI models to tell you back where it got the data. But you really do need that. So I think humans need more human AI collaboration tools where we can actually see, like, what did the AI do? What's it providing to me? I want to look at the evidence, and then maybe I want to run some tests on, is this good evidence? And did it do bad stuff to this subgroup of people? That sort of thing. And I'm sure Samantha has great stuff to say.
No, I agree, right? I was going to say a similar thing, which is that I think that we can be in a really dangerous spot of being too like, no AI is bad, and we're going to get ourselves in a weird pickle, because it's the same thing as it is for everything else we've been saying on the panel. It's just like, you need to be really honest about what you're doing. I will say there's a bunch of people, Kai is happening right now. There's a bunch of research currently being presented at Human-Computer Interaction Conference, where a lot of people are working at tools that will, as you're programming a new AI tool, try to like pull up relevant news articles of harms that have happened to help you think in real time as you're making it about these problems. There are people that are most people that are developing AI, maybe not most, a lot of them, everyone on this call knows that bias is bad if it's not appropriate for your thing and the AI tool you're developing. But they want to do a good job imagining risks, but they don't know. Failure of imagination is this term. They don't know how to think about the risks they don't already know about. With like not very much prompting, ChatGPT is better than a novice AI developer at figuring out, at prompting you with some of those things. And it's true that is going to do, at first, probably lower hanging fruit. It's not going to include everybody, but people are working on the question of what does it look like if, rather than feeding it the data of the whole internet, it is fed the data of what prescriptively we value, what our human values are, so that it can sort of serve as a team with you in these ways. And so I think that you need to be really careful, but I think that being honest about what sorts of problems, which sorts of AI can solve better than a single AI developer working alone on a problem, certainly. I think that there are applications for it that we need to be open to so that we can critique them thoughtfully and not just reject everything.
Just to add to that, there's other research, like I just heard about, like within the last week, so it's not cited in the brief or whatever, that people are trying to find ways like prompt engineering to mitigate bias, and it seems to be actually working pretty well. So there are things being done, but again, it's actually really hard to get educated on all these different things, right? Like these are cross-disciplinary, right? So many of us are doing work in education and in AI and in HCI, but and there's this whole new field of generative AI. So now there's so many different things coming out. Being aware of all of them is going to be very hard for us to keep on top of.
Oli, do you have any last thoughts? Just we've got another minute left.
In the last set of questions about kind of tools for or uses around qualitative AI and the kind of developments that are happening at a very rapid pace, which are incredibly exciting and worth paying attention to. But it does make me think about, like, for example, the canonical example of face setting that don't recognize, say, black faces or dark faces as much as white faces. One solution to that is improve the data, get more variety of different kind of faces in there, and then boom, the problem is fixed, right? And so we now have facial systems that probably don't show any different from human bias around facial recognition in that regard. But I'm not convinced that that solves the problem. I don't think many people are, right? I mean, that was a fix. It fixed that one data, but the core problem there wasn't just that one data set didn't have the right capacity there. It's that it wasn't noticed and it was able to be built and disseminated, and it wasn't until prolonged, significant, and sustained critique happened to that. So one, really supporting that process of critique as an important part of what it means to develop technology. We don't usually tend to think of critique as part of the development process, but it's probably one that is. But it's for that, in that case, it was the structural problems way deeper than the data set problems that were kind of at the core, and the fix just only addresses the superficial element of that particular kind of data set, and not over then decide, okay, so we no longer have racial data bias in this data set, and we can just go ahead and use it freely. I feel uncomfortable with that kind of being the solution. And I know everyone else on the call would support me on this as well. But that's kind of the end point is that the fixes, the easy fixes or the surface fixes and the deeper fixes are not always going to be the same thing. And so kind of paying really close attention remains important, even if it seems like last year's model didn't do this very well. Now it works better. It doesn't mean, therefore, I'm done.
Yeah, that's really a nice note to end on, to kind of always point back to the systems and the way that these kinds of issues become kind of recursive, and how that makes it hard to know what end to start on and so on, and no one strategy is going to fix all the issues. Well, thank you to everyone for joining us today. Thank you again to our amazing panelists. This was such a rich discussion, and I really think that it gave our community a lot to think about. So we really appreciate you taking the time to join us today. Thank you to all the people who attended, and you will be getting a copy of this recording. When the brief is released, you'll get a copy of the brief. And I think that that's all we've got for you today. Have a good day, everybody. Thank you again.